Welcome, everyone. Time again for our annual 5-year forecast. On behalf of Bev Anderson and I, we welcome you, and once again, a collaborative effort. And okay, are we ready to roll?
Mayor, members of council, and Madam Chairwoman, and members of the school board. We're here today to go through our annual 5-year forecast. And we have with us today Greg Grudendorst, who is the Chief Economist for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, Farrell Hansecker, the Chief Financial Officer for Virginia Beach City Public Schools, and Kevin Chatelier, one of our co-acting directors for the Office of Budget and Management Services. So we'd start off with Greg, and he'll give us some insights into the national and local economy.
Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Pleasure to be here this afternoon. Look forward to this becoming an annual thing. So what I have for you today, as I've had in years past, is I'm going to take you rather quickly through a whole bunch of, I shouldn't say a whole bunch, 35 slides on the national and regional economy and kind of paint a picture of what's going on. And I'd encourage you to stop me at any time and ask any questions you might have. One of the interesting things about the Hampton Roads economy is historically it used to really follow the national economy. So if you were looking 10 years ago and you want to know what was going on in Hampton Roads, economically speaking, you could look to the nation, and what was going on in the nation was also happening in Hampton Roads. That changed pretty significantly following the Great Recession that we had. So I'm going to take you through a couple of slides talking about the national economy before we get in the regional economy. But as you can see from this slide, this is U.S. gross domestic product. That's the best indicator there is of what's going on in the national economy, a general indicator. And you can see gross domestic product is up 21% from the pre-recession high. Since 2009, it has grown pretty steadily along a pretty straight line and has performing quite healthily. The same is true for the non-farm civilian employment numbers. So every month you'll hear this big headline number of that's all in the news about employment number, how's the economy doing. We look at these employment numbers, is it up 150,000, 200,000, 220,000, 80,000? These are the headline employment numbers, generally considered the best economic indicator, current economic indicator we have of what's going on. And as you can see from this chart, since 2009, the beginning of 2010, it has been a very, very consistent, relatively consistent trend. I mean, if you want to forecast along that straight line, it makes it relatively easy. It's essentially about a 1.7% annualized growth in employment. This is civilian employment. Every year since 2010. It's slowed in recent months, but again, fairly consistent. If we look at the U.S. unemployment rate, people get pretty excited about looking at an unemployment rate number, currently at 3.6%. The unemployment rate number in and of itself is pretty much a useless number. It doesn't tell you anything. But what you do get some information from are the components that make up the unemployment rate. So one thing I would point here is if we're looking at unemployment rates, look at the trend. What is the trend telling you? Right now the trend tells you that, well, we had a recession high of 10%. Clearly that was not good. We're currently at 3.6%, which is much, much healthier than 10%. Right now we're actually probably at underemployment. That means that there are more jobs available than we have people to fill them. There's an unemployment rate out there, a hypothetical unemployment rate that you probably actually want to be above 3.6%, closer probably between 4.5% and 5%. But the unemployment rate also changes. For example, it's very dependent on what you're measuring. If I were to compare Virginia Beach's unemployment rate with York County's unemployment rate, with Williamsburg's unemployment rate, all three of those localities have very different unemployment rates. So you wouldn't want to compare Virginia Beach to the nation. You'd want to compare Virginia Beach to Virginia Beach. So here we're looking at the nation. We have a 3.6% unemployment rate, very low, probably a little bit too low, but much healthier than 10%. Stock market, we're up almost 100% from the pre-recession high, 320% from the pre-recession low. This is bumbling. It's not quite as straightforward as employment, but again, pretty healthy overall. So transitioning a little bit from the national economy to the regional economy, what this chart is showing you essentially is what happened when the Great Recession hit and how we are relative to how we were then. One of the things you'll notice is the green line is Hampton Roads, orange is Virginia, black is the U.S. The green line is actually longer than the other two lines. That's because Hampton Roads actually entered in recession before the nation did, before the state did. When the Ford plant closed, some of you probably remember that way back then in 2006. That's actually when the region entered into recession. And so one other thing you'll notice is that the black line and the orange line look a little bit better in terms of growth than the green line. So 0% is when employment dropped into the Great Recession. And once you get back up above 0% is when you've recovered all the jobs that you lost. It took the nation and the Commonwealth just over 6 years to recover all the jobs they lost. 6 1/3 years, essentially. It took Hampton Roads 10 years to recover the civilian jobs they lost. This is just civilian employment. If we were to add the number of military personnel we lost, it'd look actually worse than this. So one thing clearly here is that the road to recovery for Hampton Roads following the Great Recession is very different than what has happened in either the Commonwealth or the nation. If we look at gross product for the region, here you can see that we've recovered the number of jobs that we got lost in the Great Recession. If we look at gross product, one of the things we can notice is that we actually haven't recovered. The economy is still trying to recover some of what it has lost. The latest numbers that we have from 2017, we were down 2.1% in inflation-adjusted terms from where we were in 2007. So I think the 2008 numbers, when they finally come out next month, we'll see them, they'll be higher than they were in 2007. But essentially, it's been really, really rough, not just for employment, but for the region's economy in general. If we compare Hampton Roads to other regions, and I don't expect you to read all these little names but you can see at the top there, the regions that have done well: San Jose, Austin, San Antonio, Nashville. They've been growing like gangbusters. And on the bottom end, you have Hampton Roads here: Milwaukee, Rochester, Tucson, St. Louis, Memphis, and then Hampton Roads. We're 6th from the bottom when we compare to other metropolitan areas between 1 and 4 million. So what's going on in Hampton Roads? Well, we can look at just civilian employment jobs again in Hampton Roads, and we can see that we had a pretty strong and consistent period of growth from the 90s all the way to the Great Recession. And then it stopped. We lost 50,000 civilian jobs, and we've struggled to recover those since. If we look at what has happened according to industry, the impact on industry has not been consistent. So not everybody has felt the cuts, and some people have certainly felt it worse than others. If we compare August to August numbers from 2018 to 2019, you can see leisure and hospitality are at the top. Leisure and hospitality, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, have done surprisingly well in Hampton Roads. There's scientific, technical, construction, manufacturing, real estate. Several industries over the past year have done really well in Hampton Roads. On the other side, we see administrative and support positions have been cut. Healthcare has been cut. Local government has been cut significantly. And if we look over the past 10 years, we get more of an understanding. So healthcare, which has grown significantly. I think at one point it grew 123 consecutive months at the national level. That industry just continues to grow and grow and grow. That's not necessarily a great thing, but it's continued to grow. But leisure and hospitality, that is a great thing. And we've seen employment there grow in the region. Federal government, surprisingly here, has grown. Then you can see scientific, technical. But on the bottom end, again, local government has probably been the hardest hit industry, wholesale trade and information. That's over the past decade. Again, the useless unemployment rates, but we're looking at the trends here. If we compare Hampton Roads to the US and Virginia, we can see, well, our trend has been relatively good. Hampton Roads historically has had a lower unemployment rate and continues to have a lower unemployment rate than the nation. But what is good about Hampton Roads unemployment and the unemployment rate and what constitutes it is we have seen pretty substantial growth in the labor force. Over the past decade, our labor force has actually grown by 70,000. That's strong. Where we are with unemployment now, the number of people who are unemployed is where we were a decade ago. Our labor force grew by 70,000. We have the exact same number, relatively exact same number of people unemployed. That's impressive. And we're seeing more and more people that actually are reporting that they have jobs. So our labor market is showing signs of strength in Hampton Roads, and that's certainly positive. The labor market showing signs of strength really comes as positive news, especially because wages and income are not. When we have one of the things that unemployment rates, especially low unemployment rates, are supposed to do is they're supposed to make the private sector, the public sector, essentially everybody, compete for the limited resource of jobs. So if you're competing over jobs, it should put upward pressure on wages. And as a region, we could use some upward pressure on wages. This shows the relative per capita income for Hampton Roads compared to the US and to the Commonwealth. So every time we're under that black bar, that means that we are below the national share. And right now, we've been slipping pretty substantially. We'd like to see that turn back up to where we were in 2009 when we were at the national average, actually just slightly above the national average. The low unemployment rates in Hampton Roads, coupled with a really healthy job market, should help to improve this trend, although it will take some time. If we look at income a little bit in a different way, this is median family income. Per capita income is easy to skew. Median family income is not as robust of a statistic, but is almost more informative in terms of quality of life. This is where Hampton Roads actually does pretty well. And the reason we do well when it comes to median family income is because Hampton Roads is one of those regions where there's not a huge disparity between the haves and have-nots. If you have huge income disparity, you can have really great per capita income and relatively low median family income where just a few contain a lot of the wealth, and that's not the case here. So in terms of a general quality of life indicator, we're still doing fairly well in that area. I'll talk a little bit about defense. Clearly defense is really important to the region. What you're seeing here are annualized defense outlays. These are inflation-adjusted dollars, and everybody can understand the importance of defense in Hampton Roads. It constitutes about 35 to 40% of the region's economy when you include the direct, indirect, and deduced effects. So you bring that all together. Why is this so important to us? Because what happens with these defense cycle spending impacts us here. You can see the Korean War, Vietnam War, 80s Cold War buildup, and I just want you to look at these bumps because I'm going to hit against on them later. And then you see the huge increase in spending in the War on Terror. If we look at military personnel in Hampton Roads, this is going back to 1969. This goes back to 1947, so the timetables are just using the most data that we have. You can see how military personnel, we see the bump coming down from Vietnam, and then we see the 80s Cold War build-up bump, and then what happens is there's really no bump when it comes to the War on Terror. So we saw a lot of spending in the War on Terror, but we didn't see military personnel associated with the War on Terror. Essentially what the Department of Defense did is they transitioned from spending money on military personnel that were uniformed, and they started putting it into technology. They started putting it into contractors. They started putting it into the private sector. So they're spending a great deal of money, but they're not bringing in military uniformed personnel like they had in the past with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the 80s Cold War buildup. So what happened in Hampton Roads essentially is we got this bump in funding in defense contracts through the War on Terror. And that went all the way through 2011, you can see here. We lost military personnel, but we got a lot of money coming in from the federal government through defense contracts. That was right through until 2011 when we entered into sequestration. Right? That's where in Washington, they decided that they needed to control and limit spending, and they tried to put a committee together to limit spending, and when the committee couldn't agree on what to do, they essentially said, okay, fine, we'll just shoot ourselves in the foot, and we'll stop spending across the board, and we won't think about this in any strategic kind of way. We'll just make across-the-board cuts. Because in lieu of being able to make a decision together, we'll just make a flat across-the-board decision, and that's what happened. And then we saw defense contracts shrink. So what happened in Hampton Roads is we saw contracts shrink, we saw continued decreases in military personnel, and so the private sector was essentially, in Hampton Roads, the private sector was swimming against the outflow of federal government jobs and money that had been pouring into this region before. And that is why we've had such a difficult time since the Great Recession. It's been the private sector, the limited private sector, really fighting against this outflow that we've seen in the DoD. Shifting gears a little bit here, clearly the port is important to Hampton Roads. There's so many different ways that you can view how the port impacts the region or what is going on at the port, but perhaps the easiest one to report on is general cargo. And the interesting thing about general cargo or just port statistics in general is that if you look at what's going on with the port and you compare that to international trade, these two things sync together. So as international trade goes up, port traffic goes up. As international trade shrinks, so does traffic at the port. One thing we can say is the number of containers going through the port are up. The number of ships are down. You guys have seen some of these huge ships when you cross in the Modern Merrimack or HRBT. The ships are massive. So there's bigger ships, fewer ships taking more containers. Essentially the share, if we look at East Coast market share ports, we're roughly holding our own on the East Coast. Sometimes it goes a little bit up, sometimes it goes down. But the port is actually in a pretty good position to see growth. The port is hugely important in Hampton Roads economy, but I don't think in the way most people understand it. The number of containers that go coming in and out of the port is less important to overall employment and direct benefit than just having the port here. So because we have the port here, this is an ideal place for manufacturers to locate. We essentially have clustered effects around logistics and other industries that use our port. But as container traffic goes up and down, these jobs are going to be here regardless as long as the port is doing well. Touching a little bit on tourism. Tourism is somewhat interesting. If we look at inflation-adjusted dollars going to pre-recession 2008, we've actually seen 16.1% growth in Hampton Roads. This is really compelling, especially since if you look over the past 10 years, we've seen hotel revenues are down 3%. So how is it that hotel revenues are down 3% and we're doing so much better? Employment is up 7% over the past 10 years. So I think the way people vacation is changing. Virginia Beach in particular, if you look at this across Hampton Roads, localities vary in how they fared, but Virginia Beach is actually pulling the region up in terms of what's happening with tourism because of how people vacation. And I can note that if you look at the shoulder seasons, for example, in Virginia Beach, right? Something in the water, huge economic impact, huge benefit, right? On the shoulder season. Even if you look at the aquarium, the amount of expenditures that take place in the off season and the impact that that has on the region is growing substantially, and is if you could push those out from the summer peak season, we can get more benefit. Really, when we've looked at tourism in the past in the region, we've recognized that this is a mature industry. We're not relocating a Disney World in Hampton Roads. We're not bringing in huge new attractions. We have Busch Gardens, we have the historic triangle, we have the beach. Those things aren't changing. So how have we been able to expand that much? And I think that's pretty significant. And one of those things is how we do things, how we market, we can expand, and what we're bringing in, the level of attractions, and expanding the season. I would say this, I have a friend of mine who runs an Airbnb in Norfolk. And you know, he started doing this just because he had lost his job and he really needed some extra money. And he said, Greg, this is ridiculous. Everybody that I get at my Airbnb is actually, they want to be in Virginia Beach, but they can't find a place in Virginia Beach, so they come to Norfolk. And he has just a big display that he puts on the table, and it talks about, you know, Williamsburg, it talks about Jamestown, it talks about Busch Gardens, it talks about the beach, it talks about downtown eating locations in Norfolk, and he is marketing the region from his little Airbnb in a way that Hampton Roads doesn't market the region, which is kind of interesting, because if you think about it, when you go to another location, whether you go to Nashville or San Francisco or Paris, right, you don't stay in one area of the city or one locality. You explore all around. And I think what people are doing more and more now is when they come to Hampton Roads, they're moving all around the region. We're trying to get data on exactly where they go. But they're vacationing in a different type of way. They're using the sharing economy. And because of that, despite shrinking hotel revenues, we're actually seeing an increase in expenditures. So that's pretty exciting. Hampton Roads retail sales is kind of interesting to look at as well. If you look at this chart, you're thinking things are great. Retail sales are up 18.8%. We've seen an annualized growth rate of 1.2% since 2006. When you dig in a little bit behind this, we've actually seen, when you account for inflation, we've actually seen a decline of 1.1% since 2006. There's a couple things that are going on with retail sales that are really important. First of all, it's one of the main, after property taxes, retail taxes are really important to localities in terms of gaining revenue, generating revenue. And what we do in Virginia is we only tax retail expenditures. We don't tax services. It's goods-based, it's not service-based. So really what's happening all across the country and actually across the world is people are transitioning from purchases of goods to services. So we were talking earlier, you know, when I was 14, I bought a pair of jeans. I bought my first new pair of jeans when I was 14. I was really excited. But I had a couple older brothers, so all I got was their hand-me-downs, green corduroys and stuff. I bought my own pair of jeans, and I remember it cost me $65 for a pair of red tab Levi's. You can go to the store now and get Levi's for much cheaper than that, right? A lot of the cost of retail goods has come down significantly, and people spend less time and less money, resources, on these retail goods than they ever did before. Things like clothing are cheaper, but electronic, everything's cheaper. So where do their expenditures go? They go to services, right? People will have people cleaning their house, doing their yard, cleaning their gut, everything you do, you know, people can get a service to do it now. So that's where the majority of the expenditures go. So if you look at our tax system is somewhat dated. It's only looking at those retail goods. It's ignoring the services where people actually spend money. So if you're losing 1.1% year over year in terms of expenditures, you should probably be worried, because this is going to get much worse. The reason it's going to get much worse is because what the State Department of Taxation has been able to do is they've been able to take advantage of online sales. Online sales have been growing and growing and growing, and the amount that we're taxing online sales, a couple years ago we got it up to 80%. More recently with this Wayfair, there was a Supreme Court decision that enabled us to tax more out-of-state businesses. So we're benefiting significantly from expanding retail taxes to online, the online presence, but that's hit its limit. So we're going to start watching retail taxes fall.
How much of a decrease in retail purchases do you attribute to the concentration of 70% of all the discretionary income to the top 10% wage earners, and also aging? So by their very nature, they purchase less, or they invest versus purchase. So how has the change in the distribution of income? Bloomberg just reported that the top 10% have 70%, the bottom 50% have 1%, and the middle 40% have 29% of the wage income, and wage income is down 3 percentage points of GDP over historical norms. So how does that contribute to this decline in retail purchases?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, if we're looking at retail, goods and the purchase of goods and services, when we're looking at goods particularly, it's a very regressive tax. So if you're on that bottom end, right, you're spending a lot more of your money on goods because that's what, those are the things that you need rather than often the things that you want. So the high-end wage earners are the people who spend a lot of money on services that are very expensive that are left out of this. So if you see the disparity between the haves and have-nots grow, right, we're seeing kind of a dual impact on this. One is people grow out of buying retail services, and the other one is that contraction gives people less money to spend on retail. So it's a negative impact when you have that disparity, for sure. If you could boost income in the middle class, if you could raise the middle class, you would definitely see a slight bump in retail. But still, with that slight bump, what you would be seeing a much greater bump is in the amount of money that people are spending on services. So there was a study that was done a couple years ago now, statewide, looking at if we wanted to remain revenue neutral, if we wanted to just keep the revenue flat, but we wanted to tax services as well as goods, we could have reduced the retail sales tax in the state from 5% to 1%. That's a huge impact. 5% to 1%, we'd remain revenue neutral. And that way, if we modernize the tax code in that way, if people spent more on services, then that would be included in the increases that we've seen here. And that would be money that localities could use, but also, much more importantly for me, it would be a much more fair way of taxation. It would reduce the regressivity of the tax code, and it would certainly be something that you could bank on much more than retail sales. But this is something that is not going to get better. This is going to get worse as we advance in the future, and certainly for people trying to make budgets work, this is something they're keeping a close eye on. Another component, of course, that's really important to localities, property tax, and that has to do with home prices. Home prices in Hampton Roads are somewhat interesting in terms of what happened here when everybody saw this housing boom. What happened in Hampton Roads, we saw much of the same impacts as the rest of the nation did in terms of easy access to money. Mortgage rates dropped, everybody could get a loan, and there was the whole industry was flush with cash. And then suddenly, you saw the drop. So why did Hampton Roads go up so much higher than everybody else? Well, in addition to the national things like low mortgage rates and easy access to cash, we also had huge increases in military spending here. We had military pay increases. We had housing allowances that bumped way up, and we had undervalued housing prices. So there was a lot more room for the region to go up. So 2007, we saw the peak hit, and then we dropped. Hampton Roads dropped, state dropped, the nation dropped. And since then, we managed to climb our way out of it. And you can see 2016, 2017, we got above zero again, so we stopped seeing housing prices fall. But it's slow. It's slow and steady. And for Hampton Roads, we expect it to remain slow and steady for some time. One of the things that happened here, in 2007, we saw the housing prices drop. Private sector, as it typically is much more invested in this, they're much more engaged. So building permits dropped in 2005. The writing was on the wall for them. They saw the market contracting, and so building permits dropped. When building permits drop, we essentially put a restriction on supply. So we have much less supply going into the market, and that's going to help with keep housing prices from falling further. But we never really recovered when it came to building permits. We still have relatively very low building permit activity in the region. We're not anywhere close to where we were pre-recession. So there's been a constriction on the supply in housing. We have a healthy housing market in the region. That means the sales, right? If you go to sell your house, the average time on market is 4 months. That's pretty low, actually. Healthy is around 6 months, so it's a seller's market right now. But housing prices aren't going up. So if it's a healthy housing market and you've restricted supply, right, shouldn't that bump up prices? Well, it should. But there's a couple of other things going on. We have a lot of houses that are still in default. And these houses pull down housing prices, and your assessor will tell you, real estate is very, very much a local thing. So some neighborhoods are up and some neighborhoods are down, and that's true across the region. But essentially, when we look at what's happening in Hampton Roads, we still have a pretty high default rate compared to other localities, so that's pulling housing prices down. We also have not seen a great deal of population growth in the region, so the demand on that side isn't really pulling up. So we've seen the contraction in supply, and we see that we have a healthy housing market. We don't expect, unless we see a bump in employment or a bump in population, we're not going to expect to see a bump in housing prices anytime soon. One other little side impact that's going on, if you think, well, housing prices aren't going up, that could be a good thing for housing affordability. In Hampton Roads, it has not been. Housing affordability in Hampton Roads, especially for low-income people, is not good, and it's getting worse. We had, when the market was booming, this issue got a lot of attention, especially with workforce housing. Department of Housing and Urban Development is coming down to do a study in Hampton Roads just to look at why are we spending so much money on rents compared to incomes in Hampton Roads. But the contraction in housing supply has not meant that there's been an increase in the availability of affordable housing. Essentially what's happened is the demand for the limited amount of affordable housing in Hampton Roads has increased, and that has bid up rents. So good time to buy, good time to own. It's a bad time to rent. Rents are high. Real quickly on population, Weldon Cooper Center does a fantastic job of estimating population. They actually do a better job in the census when we've looked at it. And they do estimates for all localities and the region as well. I've got two red lines here. Since 1960, since they began keeping records, there's been two contractions in population in Hampton Roads. One was following the Vietnam drawdown, and the other one was in 2018, the last year we have data. So this also plays into housing market, right? If our population is slowing and growth is slowing, then there's not a big demand for new houses. We're not going to see increase in housing prices. But this has other impacts as well. When the region isn't growing, you can look to one thing typically, and that's employment, right? If we're not seeing huge gains in employment, then we're not drawing new people into the region. If we're not seeing military personnel being drawn into the area through DOD, if they're spending money on contracting but not putting the military personnel in, then we're not going to see the bumps in population. And here you can see I've got these blue arrows by decade. We saw 1.8% employment growth annualized in the 60s. That was during Vietnam. And then we had the Vietnam drawdown. And then we had the 80s Cold War buildup, and we jumped up to 1.8% annualized growth for that decade. And then since then, slowly we've been reducing from 0.8% to 0.6% to 0.4% back through 2010. And our population distribution is changing too. If you remember all the way back to third or fourth grade or whatever it was when they had the population histogram supposed to look like a triangle, that's not a triangle. We're not looking like that. And if we look at the different generations too, you can see we have the silent generation, which is expanding. The boomers, you see the boom there, Generation X, millennials. And then you see the next generation, and this is something being felt across localities too, where we're not seeing many youth in this region. The younger age population is nowhere near where the millennials were, Generation X. I'm going to touch on education real quick. This has been something that's been, ever since I've been at the Planning District Commission, we've noticed that Hampton Roads graduation rates do not track or have been below that of the Commonwealth as a whole. And so the green bars there are Hampton Roads, and the black and the beige bars there are the Virginia graduation rates. 2019 was the first year where Hampton Roads actually matched statewide graduation rates. And I wouldn't say that statewide graduation rates are the top bar you want to meet. I would say that that's probably, you want to be well above that. That's the low part of the bar. So the fact that it's taken us that long to actually get to where the state is as a region is not good. And one of the reasons one of the things we certainly look at is per pupil spending. Hampton Roads does not compare favorably to the rest of the Commonwealth. When we look at per pupil spending, we actually have only 2 localities in Hampton Roads where local per pupil expenditures are above the state average. So this is a cause for concern, certainly. If we look at comparative statistics, one of the things people typically look at is high school equivalents. They say, well, Hampton Roads compares pretty well when we look at high school equivalents, and that's actually because we import a lot of military personnel who have that high school equivalence. We're not actually graduating them at higher rates. College attainment, we're right at the national level, and graduate professional degree, we're right at the national level as well. Just real quickly, government finances, and again, keep in mind this is Hampton Roads as a whole, but how do we compare our government finances here compared to the rest of the Commonwealth? We have a lot of water here. Public works is a huge, huge requirement, investment, so we outspend the Commonwealth average in public works. Parks and recreation, general government administration, and judicial administration were a little bit, and then public safety, again, we outspend the Commonwealth. It's education, community development, and health and welfare where we spend less as a region than the state does as a whole. Looking towards the future real quick, so what do things look like? Right now we have, for one of the first time in a long time, since the Great Recession actually, consensus forecast for gross domestic product is actually declining. So when we look to the future, the expectation is we're going to see less and less gross product, I guess at the national level, but essentially a slowing down of the national economy, which is not really good for Hampton Roads, not good for the nation. But when we look to defense spending and other nationalized money that's coming into the region through DOD and elsewhere, when you see that contraction, it starts putting the writing on the wall. One of the reasons for that, federal budget deficits. These are cumulative. So every time you're below that red line, you add it to the previous one. And what we're looking at, the reason I put this up there is if we look at 2008, 2009, when sequestration hit, this was one of the reasons. We're looking at a massive federal budget, huge debt, and deficits, year-over-year deficits. And when the deficits got as high as they did in 2008 and 2009, in Washington they said, okay, we need to address this and we need to do something about it. So they put through this sequestration was what happened. And you can look through the Congressional Budget Office forecast what is happening now. We're looking at trillion-dollar deficits on an annual basis while the economy is growing. So if we're losing $1 trillion while the economy is growing, what can we do when the economy begins to contract? We've been spending on our credit card a lot, and at some point we're going to have to pay for this federally. So I don't want to use the word recession, but that's more and more what you're going to look when you're picking up the Wall Street Journal USA Today. There's talks about recession. Is there a recession going to hit? One thing that there's many things economists are really bad at. One of them is telling you when a recession's going to hit. We have no idea. Right now, we're in the longest expansionary period we've been since World War II. The average time between recession is 59 months, just shy of 5 years since World War II. We're at 10 years and 4 months. The previous longest one was 10 years on the nose, 10 years and 4 months. So we are looking at some things that are stressful. If we look at what's happening right now, we're on a continuing resolution in Washington. That's where the federal government says where the money is going to go. We kicked the can from September to right before Thanksgiving because that makes sense. Not to me, but to somebody, I suppose. So we kicked the can to Thursday. The House, I think, has done a fair amount of work trying to put together a budget. The Senate has a fair amount of work left to do, but essentially what we're looking at is hopefully they kick the can again, and I'm guessing they're going to kick it to the end of December, but we don't have a budget in place. Back in August, we actually saw some progress in Washington where they said we can agree on an expenditure package. Of course, the devil's in the details, so we'll see what comes of it. But if Washington can't agree on what to spend money on, where to spend money on, or even how to pass a budget, this historically does not bode well for Hampton Roads. We have a lot of good things going on in the region right now, a lot of fantastic things actually. We have the potential for a great deal of defense spending, military construction. We've got $5 billion in transportation projects being pushed through the region right now, long overdue transportation projects. So we're seeing the economy on the rise. It's almost like we finally are catching up to the nation and the Commonwealth in terms of economic growth while we're seeing the problems come back at the federal level. And so for the next 1 or 2 years, assuming that Congress can act and pass through a budget, things look really good for Hampton Roads. Military construction high, I would say look good for Hampton Road. If you're trying to find a construction worker in the next year, it's going to be tough. Truckers are going to have an issue because now they're joining the construction market. We have really low unemployment rates. We should have a lot of federal money moving into the region. And on top of that, we have some pretty exciting things that we're looking forward to, such as offshore wind, a huge potential for the region in terms of actually growing an industry cluster if we can, collectively get together as a Commonwealth and push this forward. So there's some pretty exciting opportunities that are presenting themselves in the region over the next couple years. But when we look at this is a little bit of gloom on the horizon again. Just real quickly, why does Hampton Roads matter when we're talking to Virginia Beach? Well, this is essentially commuting patterns in the region. Right, we call this a spaghetti map at the Planning District Commission. But essentially, the way the Commonwealth has structured localities is we are so interconnected. The number of people that leave their jurisdiction of residence to go to another jurisdiction and work in Hampton Roads is 50%. Half the people leave their jurisdiction of residence to go work somewhere else. And we're third in the nation in Hampton Roads. 5 of the top 10 are in Virginia. Virginia is structured in one of those ways where localities simply have to work together because we haven't allowed them to grow naturally. And even if we're looking specifically at Virginia Beach, over 30% of the people who work in Virginia Beach don't live here, and a larger portion than that, the people in Virginia Beach who are work in other localities. So that's what makes the regional economy so important to all the localities, including the city of Virginia Beach. Anyways, that concludes my comments. And
Thank you, Greg. Any questions? We got plenty of time for discussion. John?
One of the challenges that we face is our cost of living on the standard index of 100 average across the big cities. We're 118, so 18% above the national average for cost of living. But our wages, the national average for an hourly worker, is 86% of the national average. So when you think, how can you have this underperformance of wages, but yet those underperformance of wages can sustain above average cost of living? So those are hard disparities to understand. Have any insights as to how those two things work together? Is it because more people working in a household? But how are we compensating for the high cost of living with below national average wages? I think it's $20.30 for Virginia Beach's average hourly wage, private sector. The national average wage is $23.70 across the nation as a whole, so that's about 86.5, and our cost of living index is 118.
so that's certainly a concern, and one of the things that when you're looking at these data sets, there's a couple of different cost of living indicators, right? If you look at C2ER, we're actually below the national average for cost of living, and they break it out a little bit differently. If you look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis data, we're closer to admit. So looking specifically at the cost of living indicators, I think is going to tell you a little bit more about how we actually fare. And then when we look at the average wage data, one of the things that paints us in kind of probably a light that's not as reflective as it could be of the reality is that's civilian, right? And we have, of course, Hampton Roads is very different than the rest of the nation where so much of our employment is military. And once you look at the military, it doesn't bump it up anywhere close to 100%. I mean, if you're looking at per capita there, I just showed you that's 93%. So some of that data is not quite as bad as it looks depending on the data source you're using. And I think the closer you get to the reality, I think, of the best data. The reality, though, is if we have, let's just say our incomes are 93% and our cost of living is close to average, this is a problem, right? This has been, when I first moved here, Hampton Roads, had a really, really low cost of living, and the wages were higher than they were now, and they've since shifted where the cost of living has gone up for the region and salaries have come down. And that certainly is a problem, and that's why I think having low unemployment rates here is a good thing because that puts pressure on wages to lift that up. But what we need to see, right, is we need to see what is making this a high-cost place to live. And sometimes that's a little bit difficult to understand. One of the things that I've put in presentations in the past, gas prices are cheap. Gas prices, we forgot the $4 per gallon, but they're relatively cheap, and they're actually pretty cheap in Hampton Roads, and that's a big part of cost of living is looking at energy. So why do we have relatively low energy prices here? That's a good thing, but then when we flip to housing, we see that costs are high. We need to look specifically at where those costs are high, I think, and where they're low to understand that. But really, when we're looking for economic development, one of the things in the region that we really need to target is more of those high wages, high paying jobs in order to address that. Because when we look at retail, we have a big retail section, right? Retail employment is very important to the region, but the wages that are associated with retail are not high. And so they negatively impact the very thing that you're discussing. When we're looking at manufacturing, Newport News shipbuilding, not just their ship and boat building, manufacturing tends to pay higher wages. So I think when we're looking for new industries and new prospects, I mentioned offshore wind, especially because I see it as such a huge opportunity. I know Taylor Adams is really working in that industry as well. But that could be something where we can really look to lead this region out, not just with DOD, but other options to pull wages in, advanced manufacturing that could pull us up. Housing costs would be kind of the one conundrum, especially when it comes to rents, because our rents are so high. Especially compared to wages. That would be something that if we can put downward pressure on rents and housing prices, that it would improve the affordability of living in the region.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, Greg, thank you. Appreciate it. Very informative.
All right. Next up will be Farrell Hansacker, the chief. Pardon?
Sure.
Are you
Sorry.
going?
Yep, I'm up, Tom. I'm sorry.
You're up? Okay.
Sorry.
Kevin Chandelier, co-acting Director of Budget Management Services.
Hello, members of council, school board. Good afternoon. My name's Kevin Chandelier. I'm with the city's Department of Budget and Management Services, and today I'm going to be going over the city's five-year forecast with you all. Within the document itself in front of you, there's specific information related to the City of Virginia Beach demographic information. For the purpose of this presentation, I feel like Greg covered a lot of that in good detail when he discussed the regional economy and demographic information. So I'm going to move this portion of the presentation to talk about revenue and expenditure projections. So the focus of the five-year forecast really is related to the general fund and the school's operating fund. Excluded from the forecast and the discussion today is the discussion of finances related to the city's enterprise funds such as stormwater, waste management, public utilities. The reason for this is that with the city's general fund, That's really what we're kind of working through in the current budget process right now. We work closely with schools, and City Council is going to have a series of briefings coming before them, especially December 3rd, a stormwater briefing about the potential bond referendum coming up in the future. So in looking at general fund revenues in total, this graph here shows total general fund revenues from 2015 through the forecast period. So if I could take a moment to familiarize everybody with this, the purple line there is the actual revenue collections for the general fund. The blue line is the budgeted estimates for the year, and then that orange dotted line going out are the revenue projections as a result of the forecast period. So on average, the general fund is fairly accurate in terms of revenue projections. I think actuals come in on average about 0.2% with the budgeted estimates. Drilling down a little bit, looking at them in more detail, it makes sense to start with real estate, which is the general fund's largest revenue source. Real estate represents about 50% of the general fund's total revenue. We work very closely with the city's real estate assessor to determine revenue projections in the future. So again, just to familiarize everybody with this, that purple line there is the actual revenue, the blue line is the budgeted estimate, and that orange line going out is the projected over the forecast period. Overall, we're projecting real estate to grow by 3.2% over the forecasted period. This is anticipated to result in about $18 million of revenue growth from FY20 to FY21. Our next largest revenue source is personal property, and unfortunately, it's also our hardest to project. 80% of personal property revenue comes in at the end of the fiscal year. It's due in June. So unlike some of our other revenue sources that we can kind of track and monitor over the course of the year and revise projections as necessary, we're unable to do that with personal property until we don't really see our actual collections until the beginning of the following fiscal year. Overall, though, we are anticipating continued growth in personal property, 3.7% from FY20 to 21, which will result in about $6 million, and we're anticipating it to grow about 3% on average throughout the forecasted period. Consumer-driven revenues, there's a lot going on this graph because it's showing the budget trends for 4 revenue sources. We refer to the general sales, BPOL, restaurant, and hotel as our consumer-driven revenues because what we can do is track and monitor these throughout the course of the year. And it gives us a sense of how our local economy is doing as we continue to watch these revenue streams. Just wanted to point this out that restaurant and hotel, these look lower than what y'all might be used to hearing for citywide figures because these represent only the general fund portion of these revenue streams. Other portions of these revenues are dedicated to other special revenue funds like the TIP, TAP, and Open Space Fund. Overall, we're anticipating continued growth in these revenue streams of about 3.2% and from FY20 to 21, which will result in about $5.2 million. So the previous revenues that we've discussed are all projected to increase. However, telecommunications tax is projected to decline throughout the forecast period. So a little background on this. In 2006, the state consolidated several local taxes to a statewide telecommunication tax. This tax was to be applied to services like landlines, wireless, cable, subscription, satellite services. Ever since that consolidation and the establishment of this tax, it's continued to decline. Part of the reason for this is because the state code is very specific as to what these services can be applied to, and there's just simply been changes in technology. So, for example, streaming services, Hulu, Netflix, and now Disney Plus, those type services fall out of the umbrella of this and actually aren't taxed. So there's leakage that's occurring as you hear the term cord cutters, people cutting the cable cord, dropping that service, moving streaming services, they're falling out of that tax base. So from FY20 to FY21, we're anticipating a decline of about 13% in this revenue stream, which is about $3 million, and we're anticipating a continued decline of about 3% the remainder of the forecast period. State revenue. State revenue within the general fund, for the most part, specific to departments such as human services, housing, and public works. It supports specific programs within their operations. For example, Public Works has a VDOT maintenance funding that comes in to support the paving maintenance of the city's roadways. Over the last several years, we've seen steady growth in these revenues as the state's supporting these department-specific programs. We're anticipating this to continue through the forecasted period, and we've assumed a 2.5% growth in state revenue over the forecasted period. Federal revenue, like state revenue within the general fund, is mostly department-specific within human services and the housing department. Again, in the last several years, we've seen some consistent increases in the support from the federal government related to some of these department programs. We're anticipating this to continue throughout the forecast period and grow at about 2.5% each year of the forecasted period. So in shifting from the revenues to the expenditures, I know we touched on a few of the revenues that are contributing to the overall growth, but projected revenues for the general fund are anticipated to grow by about 2.4% on average throughout the forecasted period. Looking at some of the assumptions that were used to develop the baseline expenditures of the general fund's 5-year forecast, we assumed a 2% salary increase for each year of the forecast period. Something I did want to note that's important to discuss and point out when talking about salaries is there was no additional assumed use of attrition within the 5-year forecast, meaning that salaries are fully loaded to reflect the full cost of that. Inflation was assumed to be 2% in years 2 through 5 of the forecast period. The Congressional Budget Office recently released some information projecting that over the next decade, national GDP is anticipated to grow at about 1.9%. Also, in addition to that, there was a survey that was conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia of professional survey or forecasters. The results of that survey indicated that they all project about 2% growth over the next decade. Some other budget drivers or things that were used to develop assumptions made in the forecast, we assumed a 1% VRS rate increase in year 1 of the forecast and every other year after. The state actually establishes what the city's VRS rate is going to be. They determine this based on actuarial needs of the Virginia retirement system. And so we've actually anticipated a rate increase of 1%. We won't know more about this until later this week, whenever it's actually going to be a final number will be provided to us. So we'll have better understanding of that. However, the future year assumptions of 1% at this point in time are still just that, assumptions and projections. In terms of health insurance, we've assumed healthcare costs to increase 3% each year of the forecasted period on the city side. CIP and operating budget commitments. So there was some of these things embedded in the financial or in the 5-year forecast. Example of some of these are the opening of the Burton Station Fire and EMS Station. There's an additional need to staff that with 15 firefighters and 4 paramedics. That was included in there, as well as other things like annualizing the cost of the Public Safety Workforce Development Program and the phasing in of the Sheriff Pay Parity Program. Debt projections for the 5-year forecast are based on the existing CIP as well as the existing authorized but unissued debt and future projections of those numbers. So when looking at revenues and expenditures, the city is projected to run a deficit each year of the 5-year forecast period. Revenues, like I said, are anticipated to grow on average about 2.4% over the forecasted period. Expenditures, however, are anticipated to slightly outpace them throughout the forecasted period. And it's mostly attributable to the VRS rate increase. As a matter of fact, you can see the bottom line numbers here in this table. Year 1 of the 5-year forecast is anticipated to have a $10.2 million deficit. Then it slightly improves to $7 million deficit before worsening to a $14 million deficit. This yo-yoing effect really is a result of that VRS rate adjustment happening every other year. Another way of looking at this is looking at the year-over-year growth associated between expenditures and revenues. So you can see the purple line there, the revenues are growing at that nice smooth 2.4% on average. However, expenditures are a little bit more volatile, and you have near 3% growth in 21, 23, and 25 of the forecast period.
Before you move on, have you done any dynamic scoring as to the impact of closing that gap by raising taxes or fees and how that impacts private sector expenditures and the GDP growth rate?
No, we have not looked at, our policy is whenever we're working on the 5-year forecast, we don't look to assume future tax increases, or we base the 5-year forecast off existing city council policy, and we don't make any assumptions related to the redirection of any existing dedications or increasing taxes to
I
support services.
understand that, but in the 5-year forecast, you also didn't show a reconciliation to bring expenditures in line with forecasted revenues.
Correct.
Okay.
That will be part of the upcoming budget process that we're working on right now to develop for the city manager's March budget. So one of the things that we do during the 5-year forecast, or within the budget office at least, is we typically run some sensitivity analysis. So the purpose of this is to get a sense of testing our assumptions as well as testing the resiliency of a particular fund that we're looking at to monitor. Greg didn't want to use the word recession, but I will in this portion of the presentation. So we actually ran a sensitivity analysis to determine and look at a possible outcome if revenues were to be impacted by a downturn in the economy. He had noted that every 5 years, the U.S. typically experiences a recession. It's been 10 years since we've had the last recession. So with the baseline forecast that we saw on the previous slide being there across the top, if revenues were to lessen 1% over the forecasted period, the year one deficit would grow from 10 million to 17 million, and the out years from 16 million to 53 million. It would have an annual impact of about $7 million a year that would have a compounding effect. If it were to be a deeper recession and revenues were to soften by 2% over the forecasted period, again with the baseline being the 10.2, you can see that if revenues were to decline or soften by 2%, the year one deficit would be 24 million, which is roughly a $14 million change. Another sensitivity analysis we did that's included in the document itself we tested our assumptions regarding inflation. So as I said, inflation was assumed to be a 2% factor. If inflation were applied to grow 1% higher than what was assumed in the forecast period and be applied to the year one, deficit in year one would grow to be $6 million, and year 5 it'd be $16 million. Again, another scenario to look at, if inflation were to grow at an even higher rate, and it would be 2% higher, so basically 4% throughout the forecasted period, it would grow from a $10 million deficit in year one to 18, and basically have an $8 million impact. A driver of this potentially could be the cost of goods and services going up that we experience here with the city related to a possible, if anybody's watching the news, the trade war with China, anything like that that might have a ripple through effect and be impacting the cost of goods and services throughout the economy would most certainly impact us as well. So those first two scenarios and sensitivity analysis really were kind of regarding things, what if scenarios of things that are outside of our control. However, there is a known thing that will be within our control that is likely to impact us over the forecasted period. The events of May 31st resulted in the need to renovate buildings 1, 2, and 11 within the municipal complex here. City Council approved a plan to renovate all 3 buildings at a preliminary cost of $83 million. They've actually, whenever they approved this plan, they appropriated $4 million to get preliminary work and design done on the project, which has resulted in the need to program an additional $79 million in the CIP. So in looking at that, we've worked with facilities management to determine how that program spend would look. And it would come in a phased approach with $39 million being needed in year 1, and additional $40 million needed in year 2. So based on that schedule, once fully, if fully bond funded. Once those bonds are issued, it would have a bottom line impact on the 5-year forecast of about $7 million a year. Now, again, just like other scenarios, this is built on assumptions. There's discussion going on at the state level about the potential of a $20 million interest-free loan to support this initiative, as well as a $10 million grant to support this. So Farrell's going to come up and go over the school's 5-year forecast, and then we're going to open it up for questions. One of the things I did want to talk about, though, before Farrell comes up, is some of those numbers, they appeared to be large in that sensitivity analysis or that what-if scenarios. Just remember that come March, the city manager will be presenting a budget that is balanced, and that year one deficit is reduced from the 10.2 million to a balanced budget that will be sustainable for future years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Farrell.
Thank you, Kevin. Welcome, Farrell.
Good afternoon, everyone. I know you've been sitting a long time, and I'm going to get through our slides fairly quickly. I want to get to the sensitivity analysis because I think that's maybe the most important part we'll share with you this afternoon. These are the key revenue assumptions we made when we were developing the forecast. As you can see, the forecast for state sales tax is 3% for the first 3 years, and then drops to 2.75% for the last 2 years of the forecast. Other state revenues, those revenues are the state basic aid that's distributed to school divisions on the basis of the formula for the composite index. And those are projected over the forecast period at 2.75% per year. Local revenues, that's the revenue sharing formula revenues. We project a 2.5% increase in the first year and 2.7% for the remaining portion of the forecast. Federal revenues expected to increase by $600,000 in the first year, and then to level off at a level of about $12.8 million for the remaining years of the forecast. And finally, the Sandbridge TIF tax increment financing funds, or the TIF, we would propose to use $409,000 would be diverted to the operating budget in the first year of the forecast. Our expenditure assumptions, you can let me get back. You can see on the slide here, you see the assumptions we made. I'm not going to go through every one of those because of the time. I know you've been sitting for a long period of time, but you can see the assumptions we made. Specifically, one that impacts especially the first year is finishing out the implementation of the full day kindergarten program in the remaining 3 elementary schools, which will take us to have full day kindergarten in all 55 elementary schools. Also, we're proposing a 3% increase in the first year, salary increase for school employees, and then 2% for the remaining years. Another big hit in that first year, and as mentioned, the city and the schools have a different VRS rate, but to the schools it's going to be about a 1% increase in the first year, and that's about a $5 million increase in cost. In our non-personnel part of the expense budget, those inflation items in the budget that are impacted by inflation, we just project to increase about 2%. And I'm not going to go, you can see what we have projected in our assumptions with regard to that. I'm going to get through these real quickly. Budgetary goals and challenges, the issue of programmatic priorities. If the school board were to implement or bring online a new or revised program that had a significant increase in cost, it would be very difficult to happen until about the last couple years of the forecast, and you'll see that in just a minute as I show you this slide that shows what the deficits would be. We will continue our efforts and the priority of funding for schools, safe schools, as we continue to implement the Blue Ribbon Task Force recommendations. Also, with regard to employee compensation, just that over the forecast period, we want to make sure we have a competitive compensation package for school employees. The same for employee benefits. We have a competitive benefits package. State and federal mandates. The schools get hard by those mandates over the years. And the last 2 years ago, I think those mandates total about $43 million. That's still a concern to us. We've talked about the lagging state funding over the years from 2008-09 until the current year. The state has made up some of that ground. And the final thing is we still have a structurally flawed budget in that we're still using one-time money or reversion funds to balance the budget. We use money in the special reserve fund. We want to take our reliance on those funds and incrementally reduce our reliance on that during the forecast period. This slide shows you the baseline forecast. It shows you the deficits each year. As you can see in the first years of the forecast, we have pretty hefty deficits, and then they trend down toward the end of the year, we get to pretty much a balanced budget. The impact, that significant $17.4 million in the first year, those are the results of the continued implementation of full-day kindergarten, the increased cost of VRS in that first year. This next year, we will have a significant boost in the cost of debt service. So it's going to go up. And so as the graph shows you, that first year we take a big hit, and then we gradually get down to, over the 5-year period, about a balanced budget. Want to get to this sensitivity analysis. Won't spend any time on this. Just pay attention to the variance line here. This just shows if our healthcare costs that we've projected to be 3% a year over the forecast period is 6% a year. That variance line down there shows you how much that increase is over the 5-year period. It's not an immaterial amount of money. It's a fairly significant amount of funds in terms of increased healthcare costs. And I'm going to do this real quick, and I want you to just pay attention to, right now the school board in next year's budget, I think we're scheduled to borrow about $33.5 million. If we were to increase that borrowing stream to $50 million a year, that variance line shows you how much increase in our debt costs each year over the 5 years. So in the 5th year, if we borrowed $50 million a year each of those years, we would have to pay an additional $4,177,000 in debt service costs. I did one for $60 million, $70 million, and $80 million. School boards, you will remember that the long-range building program, they showed analysis of how long it would take us to improve or replace or modernize all our schools if we borrowed 50, 60, 70, all the way up to $100 million. This scenario shows you what the increased cost is. And in the outer years, it gets very significant. I just showed you the first 5 years. Let me show you the second 5 years, which takes it out to 10 years. That first slide that showed the $50 million at about $4.2 million. In the 10th year, that $50 million extra cost of debt service is $15.8 million. So what happens when you use these kind of strategies to fund your capital improvement program, at some point in time, the amount of debt you incur, it becomes unsustainable. So I'm going to end it with that. Just a quick closing, some quick closing remarks. Well, if I can get back to the right, here we go. In that area of slow regional growth, Hampton Roads continues to experience slow but steady growth. The metropolitan statistical area's employment levels recovered in 6 years, and as Greg shared with you earlier, it's taken Hampton Roads 11 years to get back to the pre-recession levels. In the area of economic recession, there are a lot of people much smarter than I am who claim that the economy is headed toward a recession. As previously discussed, the U.S. economy on average has a recession about every 5 years. It's been 10 years since our last recession. Our hope is that the economic downturn, if it occurs, we hope the impact on our local economy will not be as bad as this past recession. In terms of the future CIP needs, those last sensitivity analysis kind of spoke to that, at least for the schools part. Over the next 5 years, there are going to be a lot of competing needs for resources within the CIP. More specifically, citywide infrastructure needs such as city buildings, stormwater, schools, roadways, etc. Sustainable future. Within that same thought is the need to plan for these additional costs, such as in a sustainable manner that doesn't negatively impact the city or school services across the city of Virginia Beach. And with that, that completes our presentation. We're happy to answer any questions.
Okay, question, Rosemary.
I think obviously some of our greatest challenges facing us is infrastructure. City, it's, besides our municipal center, it's stormwater, sea level rise to keep us from drowning. And for the schools, it's the replacing our aging schools, and so school construction. And I know that we're talking on our side to do a bond referendum for stormwater flooding projects so that we can borrow at a cheaper rate that's available now than in the future. So I guess maybe this is a question more for the board or the staff to see if the schools are considering the same thing for school construction.
Let me take a shot at that, and our chairwoman might want to weigh in. We haven't discussed it specifically, the different strategies. Actually, this is the first time the school board is seeing the impact of if you financed it with operating funds that you transfer to the CIP, what the impact would be over time. So we will be, I'm sure, soon having discussions about this very thing. And Ms. Anderson.
So, I sort of brought this up the last time we met, that we need to start talking seriously about addressing this need. But as you said, this is the first time I'm seeing this, and it's a real eye-opener. I know as city council, you're worried about 5 other things as well, but this is top on our list, obviously, for school boards. So, we worry about replacing and modernizing our existing schools. So, That may not be the top of your list, but it's certainly the top of the school board list. But, yeah, and I'm sure this is one of the top things that you worry about as well, so.
Well, I've sat on the modernization committee for many years, and there's all these schools that we take care of, and there just isn't more money to do, and at some point, and I don't know where that point is, it's a political decision that you make, where do you go to get the extra money, because it's not getting any better.
No. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. It's not, the problem is not gonna go away.
Yeah, I think it's a $300 million obligation as of right now. Mr. Jones?
The chair lady just said you can't keep kicking the can down the road, but the bottom line is as long as you continue to budget in the manner that you're budgeting, you're going to be kicking it down the road. That's the whole issue, is that you rely on your reversion funds to buy things at the end of the year that you should have been paying for during the year. And instead of having that reversion fund money and dedicate it to a fund for school construction. And so it may even put you in a position where you have to take the bad political position of asking for more money or taxes. But the truth of the matter is that you're budgeting with too short of a revenue stream in order to create and do what you have to do. And so, it's not going to be popular, but it's going to take some guts and it's going to take some doing to do it. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, Mr. Moss?
A couple questions and then a comment. On slide 56, I take it the assumption is that all those premium increases and actuarial deficit corrections for VRS are all being assumed by the taxpayers and none are being shared with employees. Is that correct? That's the last two bullets on the slide 56.
Please repeat that just one more time.
Is it correct to conclude that all the actuarial deficit correction payments, which those increases reflect, and that the 3% health insurance increases are all costs that will be borne by the taxpayers and none will be shared and shifted to employees? Is that correct?
It is correct in that it's employer cost that's built in, not any increase in employee healthcare rates.
So employees, just making sure that what they're listening, they can hear it. We're holding the employees harmless to any change in the actual dollars they're expending for health insurance premiums.
This is just a 5-year forecast.
I understand.
It's
I'm just
one
trying-
scenario.
But
yes.
it's an assumption, okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you go to slide 60, if you could please, I think I know the answer, but I just want to clarify it. This is a sensitivity analysis slide. It says a health increase of 6%. Is this 6% plus 3 for 9, or an additional 3% for 6?
It's just 6% instead of 3.
So this represents the impact of another 3%
Yes,
on
sir.
your other slide?
That's correct.
Okay, very good. My comment is, I think average family could come up here and show us a slide that's more dire than the one we just showed for ourselves as government. If you go look at page 18 in your report, and you look at that top slide of median annual income, you'll notice it leaves out year 2008, which was the peak for median family income in Hampton Roads in the city of Virginia Beach, $65,000 and change. When you adjust 2018 on that very same page and take that $79,000, I think it's $45, might be $95, and discount it to 2009 constant dollars, the average median family income over a 10-year period only increased $427. I can assure you their expenses, as you can look in the report, much more than that. My point being is, all these tough choices we talk about, we just need to be cognizant that 50% of the households are making less than that amount. They're going to be probably paying less than 50% of the taxes and fees that we raise, but they will have a disproportionate adverse effect in lowering their personal standard of living. So the compelling case we have to make for people who consistently under-execute their budgets and the tens of millions of dollars every year is, and they're not, is what is that comparative narrative that Louis talked about in this budget strategy that says we've done all the heavy lifting that we can, and that we can really ask people to, it's necessary for them to lower their personal standard of living further for public consumption, whether it's for bond referendum, if I would like for flooding. I mean, I understand the consequences, but we only see a slide about the school board, we only see a slide about the city, but we don't see a slide about that median family income. We don't see that slide of that bottom 10% family income and what these decisions and choices make. And I just think we can't lose track that that's where the money comes from. You know, and we can't lose track of that. And so we've got to be able to explain to people the merits of the sacrifice, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it, that we're asking them to make. I think that's what leadership does. And if we can't feel like we can compellingly make that case, we can't do all these things. Even if we want to do all of them, there is not enough money. I agree with the chairman. There needs to be looking about this capital allocation. It's rationing of a scarce resource, and we can't consume it all. I couldn't agree with her more on that. But to think that we're just going to be able to close all those gaps that we heard by raising revenue, I just think it's not realistic. I think we're going to have to figure out ways to shift the cost curve to the left, and we accumulate savings through under execution. We use it to pay down things for cash rather than borrowing. I just think we're going to have to change the way we do business because families have had to change the way they do business. And I just don't want us to lose sight of that perspective as we go. These are not abstract numbers. Families have these very same requirements, these very same deficits, and the very same kind of aspirations, and they're going to fall short, and so are we.
Anybody else?
I have a question, Mr. Mayor. What solution have you thought of to deal with the VRS deficiency?
For the city? Or just with the VRS rate increasing in?
For the city and/or the schools?
So the rate that's established by VRS is actually set and is determined, and it's basically set for us to pay, and that's our employee, our requirement to pay in for each of the employees that we have here in the city to invest them into the Virginia retirement system. The only way that we can really manage anything to do with the rate increase is to manage the cost increase whenever it comes in terms of trying to balance it and incorporate it within the operating budget and plan for it in the future.
And what is the time frame in which you feel or estimate that you can close that gap?
So we're actually anticipating to find out what the actual rate is this week. It'll be later this week that the state's making the decision now, and that information will be relayed to us. So we will incorporate that as a part of the budget process and continue to find a way to balance those costs, absorb those costs. I don't know if you remember a presentation that the acting Deputy City Manager David Bradley provided to you all back earlier in October about kind of where we were at the beginning of the budget process and looking at revenues and expenditures and establishing targets for departments. We actually, as a part of the budget process, had set aside a 1% placeholder reserve anticipating this VRS rate increase because we knew that something was coming. We didn't know exactly how much, but we did have a placeholder, so we planned for it as a part of the budget process, and so we're trying to address it in that manner. Does that answer your question, Mr. Jones?
Not totally, but I'll talk to you later about it.
Okay.
Anybody else? Well, listen, I just want to thank everybody for being here. You know, it's once again a confrontation with reality. And, you know, we have a mission ahead of us, and that is to work collaboratively and, you know, confront the challenges that we're going to have. But once again, I thank you all for the time. It was a great presentation, you know, great discussion, and we are adjourned. Thank you.